Welcome to Back on the Stack, a cEDH channel. We are super excited to announce that Back on the Stack is now on Patreon. Please check us out to get exclusive perks. And for everyone who's been asking to get their hands on one of our custom playmats, subscribers to our Grand Slam tier will receive one for absolutely free. Check us out today. Now, let's get right into it and see what decks are being piloted tonight.
Howdy, my name is Levi, and today I'm playing Omnath, Locus of Creation. This is a Jeskai deck with green in it, and I aim to do Underworld Breach things, as well as having an outlet for Dockside Emil. This starting hand, I kept 3 lands. Went down to 3, didn't find anything, so hopefully I draw into something.
J-Rock here, back with my Talion list. This deck can be so fun to pilot with the reanimation package and cards like Praetor's Grasp. Nothing feels better than winning with someone else's win con. It can also control the board and grind out a long game if needed. I kept my second 7 almost exclusively for the fact that I can get a turn 1 seat 2 fish into play with land drops to keep it around for a bit. And maybe even an early dockside that I can copy with this metamorph.
Hi everyone, my name is Shauna Gillis. I am a video editor for TopDeck.gg, but mostly I am just grinding tournaments with Niv-Mizzet, Payroll, and Control. The hand that we're keeping today has early mana with Gemstone Caverns and Lotus Petal in order to cast that Remora and protect it with Spell Pierce. We also have some removal for the inevitable big creatures that are going to be coming out soon, as well as Baral and Model the Mixture for a mid-game plan of powering out Niv with Dockside and grinding out that value with Baral.
Hey everybody, Eli here, and tonight I'm piloting Stella Lee Wildcard. This is an Izzet Storm list that seeks to use Stella to copy spells like Cerulean Wisps to draw my deck and win from there. For this opening hand, I was in 4th seat and already on a mold of 4, so I was kind of in a tough spot. Hoping to find another mana source here to be able to cast Stella and use this counter magic to help slow down the rest of the table.
With introductions out of the way, Levi will kick us off. But first, Shauna has a pregame action and puts Gemstone Caverns into play, exiling Muddle of the Mixture. Levi draws and plays Misty Rainforest for turn. He passes. J-Rock draws and plays Polluted Delta for turn. He pays a life, sacks it, and fetches up Underground Sea to the battlefield. He casts Mystic Remora. In response, Shauna casts Spell Pierce. It resolves and counters Remora. J-Rock passes. Shauna draws and casts Lotus Petal. She casts her own Mystic Remora. It resolves and she passes the turn. Eli draws and plays Ancient Tomb for turn. He casts Arcane Signet. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. Eli passes. Levi draws and also plays Ancient Tomb for turn. He casts Talisman of Conviction. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. Levi passes. J-Rock draws and plays Reflecting Pool for turn. He simply passes. In her upkeep, Shauna pays for fish. She draws and plays Volcanic Island for turn. She also passes. Eli draws and simply passes. Levi draws and plays Plateau for turn. He casts Trouble in Pairs. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. Levi passes. J-Rock draws and plays a basic swamp for turn. He casts Necropotence. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. In response, Eli casts Swan Song, targeting Necro. Fish triggers and Shauna draws her second card of the turn. Trouble in Pairs triggers and Levi draws. Then Swan Song counters Necropotence and J-Rock creates a 2/2 bird token. He passes the turn. In her upkeep, Shauna pays for fish. She draws and plays a basic island for turn. She moves to her end step, discards to hand size, and passes the turn. Eli draws and casts Soul Ring. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. Eli casts the One Ring. Mystic Remora and Trouble in Pair both trigger and both Shauna and Levi draw. Trouble in Pairs triggers again off of Shauna's second draw. Eli activates the One Ring, adding a birding counter and drawing a card. Trouble in Pairs triggers again and Levi draws another card. Eli plays Misty Rainforest for turn. He pays a life, sacks it, and fetches up Volcanic Island to the battlefield. He attempts to pass the turn, but in response, Levi pays a life, sacks his Misty Rainforest, and fetches up Steam Vents to the battlefield tapped. Then the turn moves to Levi. Levi draws and exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand to add 1 green mana to help cast his commander, Omnath, Locus of Creation. It ETBs and he draws a card. He plays Tropical Island for turn. Omnath triggers and he gains 4 life. He attempts to move to his end step, but in response, Shauna casts Pongify, targeting Omnath. It resolves and Levi moves Omnath to the graveyard. He then creates a 3/3 ape. The turn moves to J-Rock. J-Rock draws and casts Blood Chief Ascension. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. He passes the turn. In her upkeep, Shauna pays for Fish. She draws and plays Command Tower for turn. She attempts to move to her end step, but in response, Levi hard casts Noxious Revival, targeting Omnath in his graveyard. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. Trouble in Pairs triggers and Levi draws. Omnath is moved to the top of Levi's library. Then Shauna discards to hand size and passes the turn. In his upkeep, Eli loses 1 from the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring, drawing 2 cards. Trouble in Pairs triggers and Levi draws. Eli casts his commander, Stella Lee, wildcard. He moves through phases and passes. Levi draws and casts Omnath again. It ETBs and he draws a card. He plays Savannah for turn. Omnath triggers and he gains 4 life. He casts Sylvan Library. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. Levi moves to combat and swings his 3/3 ape at J-Rock. He takes 3 damage. Levi moves to his end step and Blood Chief triggers. J-Rock puts a quest counter on it and the turn moves to J-Rock. J-Rock draws and casts Dark Ritual. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. J-Rock adds 3 black to his mana pool. He uses it all to help cast his commander, Talion, Kindly Lord. Trouble in Pairs triggers and Levi draws. Talion ETBs and J-Rock chooses the number 2. He moves to combat and swings his bird token at Levi. He takes 2 damage. J-Rock moves to his end step and Blood Chief triggers. He adds a second quest counter and passes the turn. In her upkeep, Shauna pays for Fish. She draws and plays Otawara, Soaring City for turn. She moves through phases, discards to hand size, and passes. In his upkeep, Eli loses 2 from the One Ring. He draws and immediately activates the One Ring, drawing 3 more cards. Trouble in Pairs triggers and Levi draws. Eli casts Mana Vault. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. Eli pays 2 life to help cast Phyrexian Metamorph. Trouble in Pairs triggers and Levi draws. Stella triggers from Eli's second spell, but in response to the trigger, Shauna casts Force of Will. For its alternate casting cost, exiling Baral, Chief of Compliance. In response to that, Eli casts Pact of Negation. Fish triggers and Shauna draws her second card for turn. Trouble in Pairs triggers and Levi draws. Pact counters Force. Then Eli resolves Stella's trigger and exiles Jeweled Lotus. Then Phyrexian Metamorph ETBs and Eli has it enter as a copy of Talion. He also chooses the number 2. He plays a basic mountain for turn. He moves to his end step and Blood Chief triggers. J-Rock adds a 3rd quest counter, now putting it online. The turn moves to Levi. In his draw step, Sylvan Library triggers and Levi draws 3 cards, keeping them all and losing 8 life. He plays Marsh Flats for turn. Omnath triggers and he gains 4 life. He pays a life, sacrifices it, Blood Chief triggers and he loses 2 life and J-Rock gains 2 life. Then he fetches up Tundra to the battlefield. Omnath triggers and he adds Sans Black Wooburg to his mana pool. He casts Displacer Kitten. Both Talions trigger and both Eli and J-Rock draw. Levi moves to combat and swings his ape token at Shauna and Omnath at J-Rock. They both declare no blocks and take the damage. In his second main phase, Levi casts Lotus Petal. Both Fish and Kitten trigger. Shauna draws and Omnath is flickered through Kitten. Omnath ETBs and Levi draws a card. He casts Invasion of Ikoria, where X equals 2. Both Fish and Kitten trigger. Shauna draws from Fish, and Trouble in Pairs triggers from her second draw. Levi draws, and then Omnath is flickered, and he draws again. Then Invasion resolves, and Levi gives it to Shauna to defend. Levi tutors Dockside Extortionist to the battlefield. It ETBs, and he creates 7 treasure tokens. Levi then casts Teferi Time Raveler. Fish and Kitten both trigger. Shauna draws from Fish, and Levi draws from Omnath Flicker. In response to Teferi, Eli casts Mindbreak Trap. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. In response, Levi casts Enlightened Tutor. Fish and Kitten both trigger. Shauna draws from Fish, and Levi draws from Omnath Flicker. It's important to note that Levi was out of interaction at this point and was flickering Omnath instead of Dockside so that he could get deeper into his deck. Enlightened Tutor then resolves, and Levi tutors Underworld Breach to the top of his library. Blood Chief triggers when E-Tutor is put into Levi's graveyard. Levi then cracks his Lotus Petal for red, triggering Blood Chief again. He casts Final Fortune. Fish and both Talions trigger. Then each opponent draws a card. We should note that Trouble in Pairs would have triggered for each Talion player drawing their second card as well, but the entire table missed both those triggers. Kitten triggers on cast, and Levi flickers Omnath again. Then Final Fortune resolves, and Blood Chief triggers. With Eli's Mindbreak Trap still on the stack, Levi casts his own Mindbreak Trap. Fish and Kitten both trigger, Shauna draws from Fish, and Levi targets Dockside this time as his Flicker target. In response, Shauna sacrifices her Lotus Petal for red, triggering Bloodchief. She casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Dockside. It resolves and the Kitten target fizzles. Bloodchief triggers from the bolt going to the graveyard. With Levi's Mindbreak Trap now in the stack, J-Rock casts Fierce Guardianship. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. Fierce counters Levi's Mindbreak, and Eli's Mindbreak counters Teferi. Both Mindbreak traps hitting the graveyard trigger Bloodchief. Levi moves to his end step, and in response, Eli casts Consider. Fish and Trouble in Pairs trigger, and both Shauna and Levi draw. Stella also triggers from Eli's second spell, and he exiles Snap. Consider resolves, Eli surveils a land into his graveyard, and then draws. Bloodchief triggers twice. Then, Levi discards to hand size, triggering Bloodchief. He then moves to his second turn. In his draw step, Sylvan Library triggers and Levi draws 3 cards, putting 2 back. He plays Flooded Strand for turn. Omnath triggers and he gains 4 life. Levi then casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift, triggering Kitten to flicker Omnath. Fish and both Talions all trigger and all opponents draw. I should mention that Talion still triggers because it does not see an alternate casting cost of the overload, just the card CMC as 2. Levi was unaware of this and did not plan to take the 4 damage from the Talions on board. In response to the Psych Rift, J-Rock casts Swan Song. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. Trouble in Pairs triggers and Levi draws. In response, Levi hard casts Mental Misstep. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. Then Misstep counters Swan Song, and now with Rift back on the stack, Eli casts Commandeer for its alternate casting cost, exiling both Phantasmal Image and Opt, targeting the overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Fish triggers and Shauna draws. The table explains to Levi that at this point he is dead either way. If he responds, he dies. If he doesn't, he also dies. But giving Eli an overloaded Cyclonic Rift before he dies is leaning towards kingmaking. So, in response, Levi decides to die an honorable death and keeping the game fair. He pays a life to sacrifice his Flooded Strand, which triggers Bloodchief, dealing fatal damage to Levi. Levi is then eliminated from the game, and his overloaded Rift is no longer a valid target for Commandeer. Before the turn moves to J-Rock, there is a round of priority, which moves to Eli. In it, he casts Snap, targeting J-Rock's Talion. Stella, Fish, and J-Rock's Talion all trigger. Eli exiles Force of Negation, and then Shauna and J-Rock both draw. It resolves and Eli untaps Ancient Tomb and Volcanic Island. Snap hits the graveyard and triggers Bloodchief. Then, the turn moves to J-Rock. J-Rock draws and plays a basic Swamp for turn. He casts Mind Crank. Talion and Fish both trigger and both Eli and Shauna draw. In response, Shauna casts Pact of Negation. It resolves, countering Mind Crank, and triggering Bloodchief. J-Rock then moves through phases and passes his turn. In her upkeep, Shauna sacrifices Mystic Remora, triggering Bloodchief. Also in her upkeep, she pays for her Pact trigger. She draws and plays a basic island for turn. She casts Mox Diamond. In response, Eli casts Force of Negation from exile, exiling Mystical Tutor. It resolves and triggers Bloodchief. Shauna moves through phases and discards 12 cards. Bloodchief triggers and Shauna loses 24 life and J-Rock gains 24. Then, the turn moves to Eli. In his upkeep, Eli loses 3 from the One Ring. He also pays for his Pact of Negation trigger. In his draw step, he loses 1 from the Mana Vault. He draws and immediately activates the One Ring to draw an additional 4 cards. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He casts Mox Diamond, triggering Stella Lee. He exiles Wooded Foothills. With Mox Diamond on the stack, J-Rock responds by casting Force of Negation for its alternate casting cost, exiling Born Upon the Wind. It resolves, exiling Mox Diamond. Eli plays Flooded Strand for turn. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand to add 1 red mana to his pool. He casts Final Fortune. It resolves and triggers Bloodchief. Eli then passes the turn to himself. In his upkeep, Eli loses 4 from the One Ring. In his draw step, he loses 1 from Mana Vault. He draws and immediately activates the One Ring, drawing 5 cards. He plays Exotic Orchard for turn. He casts Spellseeker. It ETBs and he tutors Cyclonic Rift to hand. He casts Mox Opal, triggering Stella. He exiles Molten Duplication. He casts a Mini Rift, targeting Bloodchief. It resolves, bouncing it to J-Rock's hand. Eli casts Twisted Fiality. targeting Stella. He holds priority and activates Stella to copy the spell. In response, Shauna casts Commandeer for its alternate casting cost, exiling Seagate Restoration and Nezahal Primal Tide. In response, Eli casts An Offer You Can't Refuse. It resolves countering Commandeer, and Shauna makes 2 treasures. Still in response to Twisted Fiality, Shauna cast Pyroblast, targeting Stella. It resolves and Twisted Fiality fizzles. Eli then moves to his end step and is eliminated. J-Rock draws and casts Talion again. It ETBs, and this time he chooses the number 1. He moves to combat and swings his bird token at Shauna. She takes the damage, going down to 2 life, and J-Rock passes the turn. Shauna draws and plays Forbidden Orchard for turn. She casts her commander, Niv-Mizzet. With Talion on 1, she has to pass the turn. J-Rock draws and moves directly into combat, swinging both Talion and the bird token at Shauna. With nothing that she can do to stop the inevitable, she takes fatal combat damage, and J-Rock wins the game. To say that this was a grindy game would be an absolute understatement. Rarely, if ever, do we see meta deck pods deciding the winner via combat damage. J-Rock's Blood Chief put in some serious work that game and pressured every opponent's life totals. We want to thank Shauna for putting up with us for a couple games. She is arguably one of the best Niv-Mizzet players in the scene, but she's also a bunch of fun to hang out with. We hope you enjoyed watching the production. Feel free to check out the deck links listed below, and we will see you back on the stack.